All right, y'all. So I had a completely different topic set up for today's recording, but there was some breaking news from the government, and we need to cover it right now. All right, so here's the breaking news. Inflation is slowing down, y'all. It's actually better than expected, according to Wall Street. But you know me. When I look at these numbers, all I can tell you is that's a damn lie. Hello and welcome back to Lean on Success, where process improvement is self-improvement. My name is Ben. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt. And today we're going to talk about the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics just released yesterday on April inflation. But before I get into that, make sure that you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more content like this. So yesterday, CNBC reported that inflation rate is easing to 4.9%, less than expectations. The Wall Street Journal reported that this is actually the 10th straight month that inflation has been going down. Now, CNBC goes on to say that Wall Street experts was expecting an inflation rate of 5%, and the actual inflation rate of 4.9% was actually lower than what they were expecting. Now, this is why I call shenanigans on that. Now, when you hear a statistic quoted, you have to be able to determine whether that number is relevant in two ways: statistical significance and practical significance. Now, to understand statistical significance, we have to talk about sample data versus population data. Now, to make that very simple and easy to understand, population data is every single data point in a particular population. So when you are, for example, measuring the prices of things, if you want to understand what the exact price increase was of every single good and service in the month of April, you would have to have data on every single transaction that happened in the month of April in the United States. Now, that's obviously billions upon billions of transactions. Now, we know for a fact that the government isn't capable of collecting every single data point in the month of April. So they do something called inferential statistics. And basically, inferential statistics says if I take a sample of data and it's sampled properly and it's representative of the population, I then can look at the statistics around that sample of data, and I can infer or make assumptions or very accurate estimations about what's happening in the larger population. So every month, what the government does is, rather than trying to track down billions and billions of transactions to see how much prices went up, they instead pull a sample of about 60 to 80,000 transactions across a number of different categories. Based on that data, they then assess what the price increase was across the transactions that they surveyed or that they looked at. Now, once the government has that number, they then can calculate what's called a confidence interval. So in this case, the government pulled those 80,000 or so transactions that happened in the month of April, and they reported out that the price increase was 4.9% for those 80,000 or so transactions. And that's the number that gets reported every single month. What they're not telling you, however, is that that's not the real number, because again, the government didn't look at millions and millions and millions of transactions. They only looked at a small fraction of them. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the department in the government that tracks these things, they actually have reporting that releases how wrong they are, right? In other words, it's a report that shows the variance in the results of the inflation data that they get. And this basically is bringing up a topic called a confidence interval. Now, I've explained this in a previous video. This basically is saying, look, we've got sample data that says that price increase is 4.9%, but we can't say for sure that that's the actual number for every single transaction in the month of April. However, based on how we sampled this data and the size of the sample that we have, we can say with pretty high confidence that the actual amount of inflation is somewhere between some upper bound and some lower bound that's pretty close to 4.9%. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is a report from the government of the most recent annual reporting on inflation. Specifically, this report shows the variance in median price change. Now, if you look at that number on the bottom right, It's saying that your 12-month standard error is 0.12. So what that means is whatever number that's reported, the government is saying that they're highly confident that the actual price increase is either 0.12% above or 0.12% below the number that is reported. So in this instance, the number that was reported was 4.9%. So we know that that was based on that sample of 60, 70, 80,000 transactions. But in order to get an understanding of what's happening across the entire population, what that number actually says is we are very highly confident that the actual inflation that happened year over year in the month of April was between 4.78% and 5.02%. It's impossible for us to know for sure where it lands within that range, but we're highly confident that actual inflation was between 4.78 and 5.02. So if people are estimating the inflation to be at 5% and the sample was at 4.9, that's not lower than expected, y'all. It's still within that range of 4.78 to 5.02. There's no change from that target expectation. Now you may ask, okay, Ben, that was a whole lot of numbers and math and stuff I don't understand. I don't even understand why that's important. It's important because the government and our media has a vested interest in telling you what you want to hear and painting narratives to encourage you to do what they want you to do. So if they're reporting that inflation is getting better than expected, they're trying to paint a picture that things are getting better for you. And that means you need to go out and buy a whole bunch of stuff because our economy runs off of how much we spend. We talked about this previously in my video with Scott Barber talking about how money isn't real. We're going to cover that again in a later video. Here's the other part of that. I talked about there's two ways to determine if a number is relevant or not. We've already talked about statistical significance, and I've shown you based on the error rate or the confidence interval around that 4.9% number, there's no statistical significance in inflation going down based on the target expectation of 5%. It's not significant, it's not relevant. Here's the other way that you determine whether a number is relevant, and that comes down to practical significance. So let's say that we could actually prove that, okay, the number went down by 0.1%. It's lower than expectations. That is akin to you expecting a bonus at work of 3% and they actually give you 3.1%. Even if we could prove that that difference was statistically significant, that it was relevant based upon the sample size and the confidence interval, it's not really significant from a practical standpoint to regular people like us. So the media may be pointing it as great news, but it doesn't really represent anything significant to us. Now, speaking of wages, let's talk even more about how the media is trying to spin this. Now, here is a different article from the New York Times that's talking about wages versus inflation. The wage growth is represented by the green line. Inflation is represented by the gray line. Now, as you can see, prior to the pandemic, inflation was holding steady at around 2% per year, while wage growth was around 3.5% per year. Now, things started to flip-flop, got really crazy during the pandemic, but as you see, around the beginning of 2021, the gray line started to cross over and be above the green line. So when you hear people talk about the affordability crisis, that's what they're talking about. It's the fact that prices are outpacing wages. So I want to use cars to illustrate this for you. Let's say that wage growth is a car that you're driving and inflation is a car that your enemy is driving, right? Now, for us to be able to continue to afford things, the wage car has to be ahead of or at least keeping up with the inflation car. If we're earning money at a faster rate than prices are going up, we can continue to afford the things that we are currently buying. Okay. Now, up until the pandemic, the inflation car was driving about 20 miles an hour. Wages were driving at around 30, 35 miles an hour. And that was going on for several years. So if you think about it over time, if my car is driving at 35 and their car is driving at 20, over time, I'm going to start to gain distance on that other car. I'm going to run away from them. I'm going to drive away because I am driving at a faster rate than they are. When the pandemic happened, everything kind of got flip-flop, turned upside down. The whole world paused for a few weeks and then reopened. Now, what we saw after the reopening was, hey, guess what? That wage car, well, now it's doing about 40, 45. So we've picked up a tremendous amount of speed in the wage car. The only problem is the inflation car started driving 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. So during the pandemic, the inflation car zoomed past the wage car and was way outdistancing us, right? That's the affordability crisis. It doesn't matter that wages went up. It doesn't matter that people are technically being paid more, because even though we're making more money than we were 3 years ago, prices have gone up 20 to 30% above what our wages have been. Now, what this article was telling you is, hey, inflation is starting to come down closer to the wage line, which means that things are getting better for us, right? So think about it. If you had a car that was driving at 90 miles an hour for 3-4 hours, that car is completely out of sight. You can't catch it. So if you're saying, okay, well, the car's slowing down, it's only driving 50 now, but I'm still only driving 45. So even though that car's slowing down, I have no chance of catching it because I'm not outpacing it. I'm not driving at a faster rate. So the story that the government and the media is trying to tell us in light of this news is that inflation is better than expected and that affordability is starting to become better. And what I've shown you in this video is inflation isn't better than expected. It's exactly the same as what they were expecting. And that price car is getting further away from us. It's not getting closer. And before you think that I'm being overly dramatic, just remember, the government uses lagging metrics to tell us whether we're in a recession or not. In fact, when you look at historical data, the government didn't officially declare a recession until after they could confirm we had already been in it for 3 months or longer. So it's important for us not to take cues of the health of the economy from the government, because they're using all of these different spin tactics to try to convince us that things are better than what they really are. Did you find any of this interesting? Did I completely bore you to death? Did I get something terribly wrong? Leave me a comment down below and share this video with your friends. Until next time.